אנחנו ממש נתחיל. אני רוצה דבר ראשון לפתוח את האירוע, לקרוא לפרופסור רבקה טובל-משיח, ראשת התוכנית ללימודי מגדר, ופרופסור במחלקה לפסיכולוגיה כאן באוניברסיטת בר-אילן. בבקשה.
טוב, אחרי צהריים טובים לכולם. אני מתנצלת שאני אברך באנגלית. אני רוצה לכלול את האורחים שלנו ככה שהם יבינו את הברכה, אבל האנגלית שלי תהיה בסיסית, אני חושבת מספיק בשביל שכולם יבינו. Good afternoon to all. I'm delighted and honored to open our conference on חרדת בית, home anxiety, which is part of our international symposium on involved fatherhood. This conference is organized by our Center for Research on Men and Masculinity and is led by Professor Danny Kaplan. Thank you, Professor Gershon, for being our keynote speaker today. And thank you, Danny, for organizing this wonderful opportunity for us to learn more about an aspect which was for many years overlooked in our gender program. It is clear that sustainable changes in women's status, opportunities, and life paths require not only changes in social structures and policies, but in men's life, involvement, and motivations as well. Furthermore, men's well-being, opportunities, and the prices they pay for living in the gendered world we live in is a topic which requires more research and more attention. And yes, I know that men are at least partly responsible for this state of affairs. Fathers change. Fatherhood practices and roles are changing extremely and are now very different than what most of those sitting in this room experienced with their own fathers. I'm reading from the blog, This Dad is Me, האבא הזה הוא אני, by Guy Herling-Fisher, and I'm sorry that I'm switching to Hebrew. חשבונית מס, אישור הספקה, רשימת מלאי, מסמך הנפקה, הזמנת רכש, העתק ללקוח, הוראה לפקידה שתוציא איפוי כוח. כן ילדתי, עולם שלם ומחושבן מסתתר בין דפי הטיוטה מהגן, אבל אותי מעניין רק הצו המחונף שציירת מעברו השני של הדף. Despite a growing expectation and willingness for men to share fully in all areas of their child's development, several obstacles still remain to a fuller involvement. Despite the many social shifts and new family models, the social institutions are not changing at the same pace or even in the same direction. Current rights and practices concerning parental leave mean that couples choosing to relax or reverse traditional roles are heavily penalized financially. This can often mean that men are not equally involved in the important early years of children's lives. Also, certain established practices in maternity and social care have not yet fully responded to men's desire to be as involved as possible in all aspects of childcare and are still predominantly focused on a women-centered approach. As Professor Gershon wrote about 10 years ago, we are poised at a moment when changing lives are colliding with resistant institutions. I'm switching again to Hebrew for another song by Guy Herling-Fisher, but this time I'll read the translation afterwards as well. I believe this song will reverberate with some of you, those of you who see themselves or at least know the new involved father. קוקיות. כמה קשה כבר יכול להיות לעשות לילדה בת 3 קוקיות? אני יודע, זה בטח נשמע קצת עלוב, אבל אני אף פעם לא זוכר בדיוק את המוב. לסרק בלי שיכאב, להחזיק, ללפף, רק שלא תזוז ושלא תתכופף. ועכשיו תסתובבי שנראה איך יצא. אבוי, השיער כמו אחרי הפצצה. כן, כשעושים קוקיות לילדה בת 3, אפשר בקלות לאבד את הראש. אבל כל זה כסף קטן. יום הדין האמיתי יהיה כמובן, כשאשמע את 5 המילים המאיימות. חייבת לצאת, הגדולה ביקשה צמות. Ponytail. How hard can it be to put the hair in a ponytail of a girl who is 3? I know you may not approve, but I never remember that right move. To come so it doesn't hurt, hold high and then twirl. And please do not move, be a good girl. And now turn around so we can see the result. Oi, the hair looks like an insult. Yup, because when you're fixing the ponytail of a girl who is 3, you can lose your head if you do not have a master's degree. But this is whole peanuts. The real test will come when one day I'll hear those terrifying words, she asked for her hair to be braided, and I'm sorry, I have to run. This afternoon, we will ask, what does it mean to be the new father? How does it feel? What are some of the challenges? I'm happy to welcome you, Professor Gershon, to give the opening lecture on why men cannot have it all, men's caretaking strategies in the new economy. And I wish to welcome all our esteemed international guests and wish you all a thought-provoking and productive conference. Thank you, Danny, Orit, Zvi, and all who contributed to the organization of this conference.
Without further ado, I really want to introduce Professor Kathleen Gershon from New York University, Department of Sociology, right? And her work, among other things, focuses on what she calls the intertwined revolutions, taking place both in the gender roles, but also at the workplace and in private life, both in the US and elsewhere, really. And to make sense of these developments, she often uses in-depth interviews, as well as other techniques, to uncover the ways that personal experiences and biographies intersect with changes in social institutions, and all of that is taking part in issues of social change. Among her current projects is a forthcoming book on the art and science of interviewing, right? And an ongoing study about work and care in the new economy, which I think is part of what we're going to hear today. She was a visiting professor at Stanford University, University of Bremen, Germany, among other places, and it's published widely many articles and numerous books. Among them, let me note, back in 1993, No Man's Land, Men's Changing Commitments to Family and Work, which I think is one of the first books on this that focused on men's involvement. And 2010, The Time Divide, Work, Family, and Gender Inequality, with Jerry Jacobs at Harvard University Press, and The Unfinished Revolution, Coming of Age in a New Era of Gender Work and Family, Oxford University Press. So without further ado, please, thank you.
Well, let me start with a few thank yous as well, including thank you for being here and for listening to me speak English for the next half an hour to 45 minutes. I wish I could speak in your language as well. That's a downside of being an American, but I really appreciate your attendance. Let me state at the outset, sociologists don't usually state their own position, but I'm definitely in favor of involved fatherhood. So I will just go on record as starting with a personal moral position. I also want to thank the wonderful crew that put this together. Danny and Shira have done a magnificent job, pulled together just an exhilarating team of people from, if not around the world, then pretty close to it, and we've had a very exciting morning, and I hope that I can live up to the standard that my colleagues have set. So let's get going. So let me start, and I would also want to warn you that most of what I am saying is based on research in the US and data in the US, but I think that generally represent, if not worldwide trends, then certainly trends in the industrial, advanced, so-called advanced, I'll put quotation marks around that, societies. What's interesting is that we start with two different and conflicting views, often taken by different political actors, about the position of men and the state of the gender revolution. The first is the gender stall and the persistence of traditionalism. And I think in many ways this is getting most of the attention these days. These people point to the stall in women's work opportunities and work participation. They point to the persistence of male advantage at the workplace and the continuing resistance to domestic involvement, which has left women as primary caretakers. But there's another perspective that interestingly has risen up alongside it and seems seemingly contradictory. Men's opportunities are eroding and women's aspirations are rising. At least in the US, and I think elsewhere as well, men are outpacing men in their educational attainments and even in their avowed work aspirations, that is, how high they wish to rise in the workplace. In the US, for example, there has been a survey which shows that 66% of young women say career success is very important compared to 56% of young men. In addition, men's work participation has been in decline, and those who are most worried that this will leave them wary of marriage and parenthood as a result of their inability to earn the kind of income and wages that they once depended upon. So I start with this puzzle. How can we make sense of these seemingly conflicting developments? And there's plenty of data to point to the fact that they are both, in fact, accurate. That will be my attempt in this talk today. First, let me just set the stage by talking about the larger transformations in economic and personal life that I think all of these data are pointing to, but it's as if they were looking at different parts of the element, you know, the blind man who touches different parts of the element and comes to different conclusions about what is happening. On the one hand, we have the rising insecurity both at work and in relationships. What's happening at work? First, and this is primarily in terms of men's work, there's been a movement from predictable, as I put in parentheses, men's careers to what we now talk about as disposable workers. Globalization, automation, the rise of gig work, basically the transformation of the organization of work has produced this rising insecurity. For working class men in the US, for example, there has been a precipitous decline in unionization, with the result that work has become increasingly insecure and not particularly well paid. But even among the middle classes who depend on white-collar and professional jobs, there's been a shift from employer-employee loyalty to a sense of, for employers, that you're with us today, but you could be gone tomorrow, and employers of, I better not plan too long, about to stay where I am. So in both cases, there's been an erosion of economic insecurity across classes. I'm not trying to belittle the huge economic and social differences as well, but the sense of insecurity as opposed to the absolute state that one is in is very pervasive in the US and increasingly around the world. On the other hand, we've also got rising uncertainty in relationships. Singlehood, cohabitation, delayed marriage, marital breakups, all of these have become not just possibilities, but genuine alternatives to permanent marriage. Recent research shows that among men in particular, and I am focusing on men today, 40% of men in their prime middle-age years, 35 to 44, have never been married. And by the way, that data is fairly similar for women as well. If trends continue, some argue that close to 30% of the younger cohorts in the US will never marry. Now again, that doesn't mean that people aren't in relationships. We know that cohabitation is on the rise, that people move into and often between relationships. But there's a contingency now to that commitment that is pervasive in a way it has not been before. So why does all of this matter? Well, it matters profoundly. The breadwinner-caretaker bargain of the 20th century is essentially in decline and in my opinion, will never come back. That bargain was based on, like it or not, a bargain between a steady earner on the part of men providing a home where there could be a steady caretaker on the part of women. That didn't mean everyone was happy with it, but it did mean that that was the predominant pattern. Today, there's almost gender parity in the labor force, with only a small gender gap between the percentage of men and women who are employed. I would also like to point out, however, that declining gender gap is based more on men's withdrawal from the labor force than it is on women's increase in the labor force. And we tend to forget that it goes both ways. What does this mean concretely? It means that as recently as the latest report I saw is 2017, 2/3 of US mothers are either primary or co-breadwinners. 41% are primary breadwinners. What do I mean by that? I mean that they are earning as much or more than their partner. Now that includes both married and single women who are indeed likely to be the sole, not just the primary earner in their families. But there are also 23% who are what can be thought of as co-breadwinners. And these are partners in which women are earning anywhere between 1/4 to 1/2 of the household income. However you want to look at this, men are, in general, with the exception of a relatively small group, are no longer the sole or primary breadwinners of their families, which cannot help but have profound consequences for how people are living their lives. Here things get even more complicated. You would think in an era when women were going to work, when families depended on 2 earners, or in some cases 1 female woman earner, that the institutions themselves would respond to these new needs and reinvent themselves appropriately. Not only has that not occurred, but the opposite has occurred. And I think this is a puzzle we need to pay a lot of attention to. On the one hand, work itself has become even more demanding than it was 50 or so years ago, when families were less likely to depend on 2 earners. The ideal worker, which Joan Williams so presciently pointed to some time ago, is no longer just the 9 to 5, go to work every day, don't take any breaks. The ideal worker now puts in longer days. And I would add nights, as some of the stories I will tell you about will tell you. The ideal worker today is literally on call, wherever they happen to be and whatever they happen to be doing. On the other hand, the rising standards for parenting have also risen. Now we have not just the quote-unquote intensive mother that Sharon Hayes pointed to some time ago. We have the intensive parent. Recent research shows that people across classes expect both mothers and fathers to be intensively involved in their children's lives, to cultivate them as best they can, and to do the best they can for their children by spending a great deal of time with them. All of this on top of the fact that, especially in the US, and this varies cross-nationally, and certainly I'm happy to point to all the other countries who've done a better job. But in the US, we still continue to see the world as based on the quote-unquote self-reliant family, that the family should be able to take care of itself with very little in the way of either state or employer support. So what we have here is what I would call an intensifying clash between a number of greedy institutions. The puzzle here is how are people dealing with this? How are they responding to this clash, which is perhaps always been there for women, but is increasingly there for men as well, and that is what I will focus on today. So how are men responding to this clash, and what are the implications of their responses for gender inequality, for what kind of families we live in, and for the welfare of our children, and for class inequality? How does this intensify and rearrange class life chances? So to answer this very large question, with obviously limited time and resources, I decided to go to what I think of as the heart of the new economy. That is the places where these changes are happening the fastest and are, in some sense, on the cutting edge of what we can reasonably expect to be changes that are going to be happening, if not already happening elsewhere. So I conducted interviews in the Silicon Valley area and the New York area. I do want to hasten to add that we also have very idealized views of both of those places. Silicon Valley is, in fact, a very wide swath that extends from, if any of you know the US geography, from San Jose to the south to Fremont and above to the north. It includes many working class and poor neighborhoods as well as very wealthy ones. And in some ways it's interesting how interspersed they are. In New York, similarly, even though New York is more densely packed, part of that density means that people of different classes, races, ethnicities, occupations live very closely together. So even though I focused on these cutting-edge places, I did so through random sampling. With one exception, I excluded the very wealthy neighborhoods. I figured the billionaires in Silicon Valley can take care of themselves, and I'm not going to lose a lot of sleep about how they handle work-family conflict. But for everybody else, and for everybody else, I don't just mean the poor and the working class. I mean a group that we, at least if we measure class by education, for example, even by income in the Bay Area, then I understand why we're starting to talk about the quote-unquote 99%. It's harder and harder to distinguish between those variations because the precarity that people live in appears to be very similar. So indeed, I did get a very diverse group of people by sampling in this way. I'm going to focus today only on I conducted 120 interviews. Slightly more than half of them were with men, and that's the group I will focus on today, but I'm happy to discuss what the women had to say, and you'll see a little bit about that toward the end. They're a very diverse group, Asian, African American, Latino, half white, but by American standards, that's a reasonable thing to expect. Most of them did have college degrees, but certainly by no means all. And college degrees can mean something very different in the US, from some elite college to some local place that they managed to get through over many, many years of working as well. I also, interestingly, got a mix of people who work in both new economy jobs and what I think of as old economy jobs. Nurses and teachers, for example, and administrators, and some interesting findings by doing that, which I'll talk to you about later. The new economy jobs were also interesting because they weren't all techies and computer engineers. They were also the people who were servicing the techies and the engineers. They were, yoga teachers and trainers in gyms and places that delivered food because no one else had time to eat or time to cook and barely time to eat. So I began to think of this as sort of Nerdistan and Servicetan, seems to me to be the world that we are entering very quickly. And the households as well were very diverse, from singles living alone to cohabiting couples to the married. Okay, so here's to the good stuff, I hope. What did I find? And again, I'm only talking now about men's strategies, but I'll talk a little bit about how women's strategies fit in. I discovered a very diverse group of reactions to a similar shared set of dilemmas. This is just a general preview, and I'll go into more details. The first group I come to think of as the hyper-traditionals. We think about the decline of traditional arrangements. But what I found with this group was, in some sense, not so much what we had before, the father knows best, you know, dad comes home at 5 o'clock. The mom let the kids go out and play while she hung out, you know, and cooked the meals or talked to her friends over the backyard fence. Quite to the contrary. These were people who were not just divided in their gender spheres, but overly, I don't want to say overly involved, but spending an enormous amount of time in those spheres and doing everything they could to live up to the ideal worker norm on the one hand and the intensive parent norm on the other. At the other end of the spectrum, I found a group that I've come to think of as unencumbered. These were men and women, and the percentages that you see here are the percentages who ended up in each of these categories. Can you still hear me? Is that still working? Yeah, good. Which were fairly evenly distributed, you can see. And these were people who had decided, and I'll get to the reasons, that commitment itself carried too heavy a price, or in some sense was denied them by their lack of resources, and came to see self-reliance as their best form of survival in this new world. The third group, which I think we're all quite familiar with, the so-called second shifters, if you will, were couples in which while both couples were responsible for work, women were primarily and in some cases entirely responsible for the home as well. Sort of the do-it-all women as opposed to the have-it-all women. But there were many men I talked to who were in those relationships. And then finally a group I call the work care pioneers. Now, yeah, I think something happened with the, is that it? Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, that's much better because I have an echo now. Good. I don't want to call them egalitarians. You'll see why in a second. But I do consider them pioneers. And what I mean by that is they're struggling against the institutions. They're trying as best they can against the odds, so to speak, to create a new way of integrating work and personal life in their lives. Okay, so how does that happen? Well, the first thing I want to say is that very few of the people I interviewed planned on ending up where they were at the time that I interviewed them. These were not their life goals, especially, actually of all of them, the pioneers were the ones who had hoped to do what they accomplished. So let me give you just a few examples, and I don't want to take too much time with this because we have a lot to cover. But there's John. He had a spotty career as an engineer, going from firm to firm, but his wife developed an illness, even though she had a very promising, potentially more promising job than he did, and he suddenly found himself as the sole breadwinner, while she, in exchange, felt the need to focus obsessively on her son, so much so that he was actually worried about that. Then there's Weston. Weston was very successful in tech. He moved up. I would also add, moving up in tech is a kind of a mixed bag, because the more you move up, the further away you get from the actual work that you enjoyed doing. And he, in some sense, wanted to remain doing what he was, but his wife hit a glass ceiling in HR. And many of these companies are very sex segregated by the kind of work they do. So when his child arrived, his wife was so estranged from how unhappy she was at work that she felt she wanted to quit, and he felt the need to help her. As a result, they decided they would try to start a business on their own. But for Weston, that meant holding on to his old job, of which he would have been happy to leave, while also starting a new business, while his wife stayed home to work with him on this new business, but of course became not just the primary caretaker, but the very involved caretaker. So what do these, and I have many other examples which I couldn't possibly go through today, but what do these people have in common? Despite their desire for family involvement, they hit demanding jobs that required very long days, and in many cases, very long nights as well. I talked to someone whose husband, and that's why I'm not telling his story today, had to, and it's a very well-known company, and I can't give you the name of the company, but he was literally required to pick up a phone call at 3 in the morning if necessary, or he would lose his job. So despite the desire for family involvement, there was simply, they had to become hyper-ideal workers just to keep their jobs and keep their families going. The overwork left fathers absent and largely frustrated, and the mothers as default caretakers. Both were frustrated. This was not what these people had set out for. And not only were fathers frustrated about not being able to be more involved, but mothers became isolated as lone caretakers, and the tensions over these separate spheres intensified. So I like to think of these almost as a spectrum. At the opposite end of that spectrum, I would describe what I call the unencumbered. The unencumbered consists of two groups. First, a group I would call confirmed singles. Most of the men I talk to would fall into this category. And the second I will get to shortly are estranged fathers. So David was a freelance bioengineer. He had not been able to, quote unquote, make it, but was determined to keep trying. We interviewed in a coffee house office place in the middle of, one of these urban areas that's become very common in the U.S., where people literally go in, sit at their computers, and seem to be working. That's all you can say about them. But they're clearly disconnected from anybody they're working with. He'd had a series of live-in girlfriends, but couldn't possibly consider the possibility that he could take on the commitments of marriage, and certainly not children, given his prospects and what I would call at the time his depression about the situation he was in. Estranged fathers, who tend to get the most blame, I think, these days, at least in the U.S., had a somewhat similar trajectory. Angel or Angel had a series of dead and low-wage jobs, and he could not keep one for very long because these came with no employment contracts and had no set schedule, and he never knew when he would work and when he wouldn't. He was married and had several children, but he is now separated from his wife, estranged from his kids, as much because he can't afford to support them and therefore doesn't feel he has the right, in a sense, to have a relationship with them, and certainly has no plans to remarry. So what brings these two men and their compatriots in my sample together? They had converging paths in both work and relationships. Setbacks and insecurities at work, which really hit to the heart of their identity and created what, they wouldn't have used this term, but we as sociologists do, created a stained identity, if you will. They felt they lost the right, so to speak, to a family. And they also had fragility and difficulties in relationships because their partners also were frustrated and did not, if they couldn't be there for them in the ways that they needed them, then they had no desire to continue them. So what are the consequences? The consequences here is that men who may on the surface appear simply to be irresponsible are really making what to them seems like the only quote-unquote responsible choice, which is to limit their commitments to partners and to children because they can't live up to the increasing demands of masculinity itself. Okay, this one's a kind of a familiar story. These are people who are co-breadwinning couples in most cases, but in some cases, primary breadwinning wives where the woman was earning not only as much, but more, and sometimes all of the family income. But here too, the desire to be egalitarian in their home life was thwarted by circumstances beyond their control. Kel's story is unfortunately became very familiar to me and heartbreaking at a certain level. Kel is married to a physician, a woman physician, and he works for a startup, which is just trying to make it and very worried about whether or not they will. When they became pregnant, and they had always been explicitly committed to the idea of equality at home as well as in the workplace, his wife was able to work out a flexible schedule because she worked with a team. The team, because it consisted of women as well as men, took very seriously that parenthood was important and that it would not endanger her career to pull back. Kel, on the other hand, worked for a company in which his boss literally said to him, sure, you can be an equal parent. You can take time off with your young son, who's barely out of infancy. Just remember, I can hire someone like you for half what I pay you in India or Russia. I just want you to keep that in mind. That was Sophie's choice, so to speak, for Kel. Did he endanger his ability to bring in his share of the family support, or did he lose out on time with his young baby? Ron, on the other hand, had a neurotic job history. In fact, he found stability when he and his wife opened a daycare business together, which involved both of them doing equal amount of work. But Ron, not quite comfortable thinking of himself as a daycare provider, also felt the need to start his own business, this one in music. So while he worked equally with his wife on the daycare business, he added another job onto that, starting his own business. So when the daycare work is over, His wife takes care of the family, and he takes care of his new business. So what does this tell us about the institutional roots that leave explicitly, at least verbally egalitarian men toward a position where they depend on their spouses, in all of these cases, female spouses, to do it all? They had demanding but insecure jobs, and that's a really scary combination. And they had an equal or higher paying partner. One of the more interesting things I discovered, and I don't have the stories here for you because I'm focusing on the men more than the women, were how old economy jobs for women, such as running a daycare business, are more stable and more predictable than the new economy jobs men are attracted to. And so the irony is that in many cases, the women become the main breadwinners, let's say the stable breadwinners. It may not be that they're earning a lot. It may not be that their long-term prospects for advancement are very high, but they can be depended on to keep the family going while the man can be the risk taker at the workplace. But unfortunately, the consequences are fathers who are resistant to taking that time leave the women with both the responsibility for the steady income, if not the big gold mine, right? And become overloaded while these men seek the gold mine, thinking if I make the sacrifices now, I'll have something better later. Again, strained bonds there as well, and you'll see that in some of the tables I have. Okay, some of the better news stories here. So I did find a very large portion, about a third of the sample, is seeking equality against the odds. Here, however, there are two variants worth reporting on. First, you automatically, when you think of equality and sharing, you think of fatherhood, parenthood, raising children. But a large number of these people had decided that the best way to ensure equality was not to have children, because caretaking itself has become such a big obstacle to equality. In fact, it seems to be increasingly the biggest obstacle. So let's take Alec as an example. He's a computer tech working at a big company whose name I can't name. And it's a very fun, exciting job. He works around the clock. He doesn't complain about it. It's fun. His partner, they're not married, they cohabit, but they're committed, is a biochemist, and she loves her work too. But whether you see the price, I'm not sure that he would be willing to say it was a price, but the outcome is that they feels it's safer simply to have no children at all. That not to risk their financial security or their personal life, and also not to risk their relationship, which they feel would be quite strained if they took that on. So demanding jobs for both partners creates this sort of dilemma, this trade-off between earnings and autonomy. That is, you can be both equal and independent, versus parental caretaking, which requires a completely rethinking of that bargain. So here we are, sharing and work and caregiving, sharing. Again, I'm going to be careful not to say egalitarian, that's a loaded term, but let's say hoping and seeking equality, if not always finding it. Larry is a really interesting example. Larry's a freelance coder. He also hopes to catch the brass ring And the only way to do that is to be out on his own. His partner has a very steady job as a senior manager, is able to support the family, and he cares for his toddler during the day. In fact, he takes his toddler to a place called Hacker Dojo, which is where a bunch of his buddies hang out all day. They bring the kids, and I'm not sure what they do. Don't ask me what they do. They play around with algorithms and try and sell them to others. Michael, on the other hand, is in a much more sort of, job we're used to. He's a financial advisor, but he works on commission. So that means he can decide how hard he's going to push himself and how much he's going to pull back. He can only do that for so long or he'll lose his place in his company. And his spouse is a project manager who also has flexibility. So what they've decided to do is for both of them to work half-time at home. It doesn't mean they're staying home and being with their child all the time, but at least they're at home. They're also, and I think this is a peculiarly American situation, and I hope it is, but I'm not sure. They're very reluctant and resistant to use child care. First of all, high-quality child care is extremely expensive. They would use it in a nanosecond if they trusted it. But the availability of child care is so spotty that if you are an quote-unquote intensive parent and you can't afford the best, then better to do it yourself. In both of these cases, there's a kind of gender flexibility, a blurring of the boundaries, if you will, and an explicit commitment to do what they can, even slightly against the rules. But it often does involve, as I stated before, that wives have more security in the old economy that allows the husband to take a little more of a chance. And both of them enjoy the ability to what I call lean out. I sure wish we could talk about leaning out more and less about how somehow the way to get ahead is to lean in. We need to really redefine from the top down what it means to be a good worker. But what's the cost? Leaning out is risky, for one thing. One cost is to the future. Not just the future of your career, which may sound like, well, okay. For some reason, we think jobs are important, but we think careers may be some selfishness on the part, especially of women, which I personally think is ridiculous. But in an age of insecurity, it risks financial security, not just having it all, hardly. It risks survival. And of course, for men, it risks their identity. If you're not a committed, full-on worker, what are you? How do you define yourself? How do you justify yourself? The second point I want to make here about all of these couples, and I could talk to you about many of them, is that they have a very difficult time imagining how they can sustain the situation. In virtually every case, they only had one child and were seriously concerned about having another because that would be the decision that tipped the apple cart. But even in their current situation, it began to seem unsustainable and exhausting. Okay, quickly, I'm getting to the end. If I compare all these groups, who's most satisfied? And if you look at this chart, and I've divided it by gender, what you will see, I think the first thing to notice is that the work care pioneers are most satisfied for both genders, okay? Women are more satisfied, what I would say is The question actually is, do you prefer your current arrangement or do you prefer a different arrangement, which is different than satisfied? The pioneers were the most likely to say they preferred their current arrangement. After that, it gets a little muddier. As you can see, among the women, the divide is quite great. Other than the egalitarians or the pioneers or whatever you want to call them, the preference drops considerably. The hyper-traditionals are next, which is interesting. And my theory there is that it's because it's still better to have a steady income, and even if it's not, the perfect modern way, it works. But the unencumbered women are much more in favor of their situation than the men are, and I think that's the thing I want to point out with the men. The unencumbered men are lonely. They feel they haven't somehow achieved the kind of masculine maturity that the world expects them to. Well, here you go. Women do it all. The women are the least satisfied. The men, sad to say, are not quite as dissatisfied as I wish they were. Listen, there's some advantages to having someone else do it all, let's face it. Quickly. The next question is, if you couldn't have an equal, what would be your second choice? Now, obviously, the work care pioneers don't fit here. Oh, how many people prefer, among the other groups, who would prefer egalitarian arrangement instead? And again, here what you see is fairly straightforward for women. First, the women who do it all, then the single unencumbered women, and then again, finally, the hyper-traditional, but I want to point out that almost half of those women would also prefer egalitarian. For the men, it's slightly different. The men whose wives do it all aren't that in favor of egalitarian, as again, I wish they were. But the unencumbered and the hyper-traditional would, have I got that right? Oh, yeah. Sorry, I didn't get that right. I knew I just changed this table and I knew I would mess this up. So it's the unencumbered and the women who do it all that are more likely, is that right, to prefer egalitarian. And it's the hyper-traditional men who are the least likely to prefer egalitarian. I presume because they're extremely successful. Even though they're working very hard, they're getting rewarded for it, whereas so many of the other men are not. Okay, I'm getting to the end. How do I explain all these differences? I tried to keep too much sociology out of this, but I want to get now to what the explanations might be for all these varied differences and what we might do about it. The first thing I really want to underscore is that men's personal preferences do not explain the outcomes. Not only did very few start with this preferred path, they ended where they are because of the constraints and the opportunities that came their way. This is not an individualistic explanation, and I think if we truly want to understand fatherhood and men and as fully human beings, we need to realize that just like women, they are conflicted. They're not getting what they want. The men are more divided than the women when it comes to preferring an egalitarian partnership. But that said, most of them do prefer it. And the differences between men and women are not as great as the differences among men. So we need to focus on those, in my opinion, we need to focus on those alliances. If that doesn't explain it, what does? First, fear of job loss pushes hyper-traditional men toward overwork. This is the unstated effect of insecurity. It's not just that people lose their jobs. It's that the people who don't lose their jobs are afraid of losing their jobs. And that leads them to overworking, even when they would prefer not to. The lack of staple work pushes unencumbered men away from caregiving, which ironically I wished were the opposite. If we could begin to see caregiving as equally important, equally socially valued to market work, then those men would be much more likely to see alliances and commitments as a partnership that they could share in, not just by offering income, but by offering support and care. Letting women do it all might advantage men in some ways, but the costs are enormous, as you could see from my gender divide, because it produces so much resentment. And resentment ultimately produces resentment on the other side, lack of appreciation on both parts. Trying to share it equally comes with its own risk: job insecurity, exhaustion, strained identities for both men and women, who are, for men, not being ideal breadwinners, and for women not being ideal parents. The point is that while these men may have faced different contingencies and the trade-offs they had to make constrain all of them. So my plea in 25 seconds or less so I will make some very general statements about how to reframe the debate rather than the specific policy implications that flow from that. The first is that we must move beyond the notion of having it all. Having it all sounds so, had come to mean you're selfish. Why should you want so much in life? You're a middle-class woman who's just too privileged. Work-care conflicts are not confined to women, and they are not confined to the middle class. And caring for your family as well as seeking meaningful work, there is nothing less selfish than those two pursuits. As Freud, I begrudgingly must refer to Freud, once said, to be healthy is to be able to love and to work. And finally, we can't return to men's breadwinning as the basis for caregiving, for family structure, for any of these things. The new economy and the new world that we've constructed make that beyond a fantasy. They make it counter-effective to the point of destructive. Instead, the new realities that we in the globe are living in require, to me, that we redefine what we mean by the ideal worker. The ideal worker leads a balanced, healthy life. That means, but what does that mean institutionally? It means regulating the greedy workplace. There's no reason we can't develop legislation that supports reasonable time norms for all workers, and that includes equal opportunity and anti-discrimination, not just against women, but all caregivers. Secondly, we need to redefine the ideal caregiver. We need to recognize the caregiving rights of fathers as well as mothers, and we need to create universal, high-quality child care supports. And what I mean by child care supports is not, yes, of course, parental leaves, yes, good daycare centers, but childhood doesn't stop there. We need to build our communities around our children and put our money where our mouth is, which is that all children matter, and that they thrive not from one intensive person who may or may not be particularly happy or adept at what they're doing, to recognizing and paying people who are dedicated to and are respected for the work of caregiving itself. I'll make you a bet we'll get a lot more men in caregiving when we do that, by the way. If we don't restructure our institutions, then these will remain individual problems that people will have to work out a patchwork of inadequate strategies. And fathers, unfortunately, will remain on the margins as the care crisis work intensifies. And I think we would all like to see fathers brought in to the fully human work of taking care of all of the rest of humanity. Thank you.
And I would like to invite our Professor Oli Binyamin from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Wherever you feel, if you want to sit here or go back, wherever you feel comfortable. You can go down if you prefer. And Oli will add her edge, I think, to this discussion, and then we will open it for discussion.
Hi. Thank you so much, Danny and Shira, for inviting me to present this discussion. And thank you, of course, so much, Professor Gershon, for a fascinating analysis of one of the most intriguing phenomena of our time, the intertwined nature of care and paid employment in families, in couples, relationship, in contemporary masculinities, and current femininities. It is always with great pleasure that I encounter your nuanced analysis of the diverse possibilities created by distinct labor market trajectories in men's and women's lives. I believe that recognizing the impact of the new economy on family survival struggles, next to the emerging form of managing obligations of care and paid work, is necessary, and that the way you're doing it is inspiring. In my discussion here, I'd like to try and compare some of your arguments with the Israeli dynamics, as was reflected in several different sources, as I think it is a good way to show the strength of your arguments and the applicable nature of the complex understanding which you so eloquently propose. In Israel, like in the US, the new economy has transformed ideas of paid employment, leaving people facing a gap between their aspiration and their options, as well as a very painful gap for many, between expenses of childcare and child rearing and households' available income. Like in the US, the new economy and the erosion of job security for men means that in quite a few households, women become the primary and or the only breadwinner, or in Professor Gershon's words, women and men must share in the work of supporting their households. In Israel, almost 60% of the women are employed. Of them, 68% are employed full-time. Importantly, 77.4% of married mothers are employed, and when the children are over 15, most are employed full-time. About 70% of married couples live in a dual earner arrangement, which Professor Gershon sees as an irreversible gender transformation. In the Israeli context, Jewish dual earner families are supported by a generally effective system of childcare facilities, and quite a few of them now offer arrangements that keep children until 4 or 5 in the afternoon. Among the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, figures are significantly lower, with structural barriers including minimum coverage of childcare facilities and limited public transportation, leaving many unable to fulfill the dual earner model. What I believe is most important in Professor Gershon's work is the requirement of multiplicity, taking into account current trends in men's employment. The multiplicity she highlights allows us to recognize the importance of change that does occur in the margins, as me and Oriel Sullivan argued a long time ago, and account for the embeddedness of the social in the economic, the social management of care and employment as embedded in the economic of labor market transitions and neoliberal reforms. Professor Gershon's report of 21% of men in her sample, only 1/5, as becoming hyper-traditional. Hyper-traditional are men, as we just heard, who emphasized and extend breadwinner-caretaker division. These men experience a conflict between their desire for family involvement and their demanding jobs, which require long work hours, long work days. Fathers are therefore absent, while mothers remain isolated caretakers. This picture is supported by findings presented by a recent study conducted in Israel by Amit Kaplan. We heard her this morning, another part of her results, and her colleagues. Kaplan presents preliminary findings, according to which large numbers of men in Israel are caught in the becoming hyper-traditional route, despite the employment of their partners and their high motivation to be involved with their children. This pattern turns particularly painful during time of divorce, when the devoted breadwinner is often punished, getting very little time with his children. These men tend to experience themselves as dually deprived, working hard to fulfill the good provider role and blamed for not being more involved. Professor Gershon's next category of 23% of her sample as men who remain unencumbered were the men whose labor market trajectory fails to stand the requirement of the good provider role. Professor Ronnie Stryer from Haifa University has recently discussed this category in his analysis of fatherhood in Israel in the context of poverty. He showed that fathers that are unable to stand standards of alimony payments and are blamed by authorities and families alike for lack of responsibility are longing for better bonding with their children, and that they are able to establish such stronger relationship, but they need to be supported and guided by activities that support their position as fathers in front of their children. I think Nadav just referred to that in his work. The third category of relying on a woman to do it all has emerged recently in the Israeli context in a study of economic abuse presented by Ariane Renan Barzilai from Haifa University as well, who showed how exploitative practices of men leave mothers under intensified forms of control over their income and expenses, relying on a traditional image of the men as understanding the economic stuff to control women and leave them in immense debts and their children in harsh material scarcity. The fourth category presented by Professor Gershon is that of sharing work and caregiving, emerged recently in a study conducted among Israeli-Palestinian couples by Inshara Khoury. Resembling the route described by Professor Gershon, Inshara Khoury found that egalitarianism is supported by the secure jobs of the public sector, where men were employed in welfare, education, and healthcare occupations. The main findings that emerged in this context was a fascinating social process in which Palestinian men become involved fathers. These men are expected by their traditional context to put their families and extended households before their devotion for breadwinning. Their involvement emerged when they consciously politicized their responsibility for their families in ways that meant creating an alternative for the future Palestinian society. To conclude, I'd like to frame both the US and Israeli context with Melinda Cooper's recent understanding of the neoliberalism as supporting traditional family values and traditional gender roles. As I showed in my qualitative work on job insecurity, this is a paper, symbolic interaction paper published already in 2003. Sorry, on job insecurity and couples relationship. And as Professor Gershon has shown here today, the insecurities of the labor market push couples backwards to more traditional arrangements. The new economy defeats the revolution at home, which is unfinished, as Professor Gershon's book has shown. The new economy attacks men's sense of fatherly commitment by polarizing the labor market and demanding either too many or allowing too little work hours in ways that leave many couples unable to maintain the open marital conversation, the practical and flexible marital conversation that will facilitate the much-needed egalitarian management of work and care obligations. And I'd like to add that it is so important to take Melinda Cooper's understanding of the traditional trends that we see as part of the neoliberal project, because it is important for women's organization and feminist projects to know with whom we must not cooperate and how we must not remain silent in front of the destruction of security in the labor markets and the possibility of social services to support our families in staying together and protect our children. Thank you very much, and thank you again, Professor Gershon.
And Lisa is asking a question.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, for the fascinating, very enlightening talk. I think you mentioned in your analysis in one of the categories there was 11% of the men who you interviewed who deliberately reject protocol who decided not to have kids. Could you please elaborate on this category?
Yes, and I guess I should also clarify that those percentages were based on the whole sample, which included women as well. And to tell you the truth, since I was drawing on, I haven't calculated, can you hear me?
Yeah,
can people hear me? I haven't calculated that by gender, but I think it's true but it's about equal. So the question about not having children. Well, the first thing I want to say is it's fine not to have children. I don't think we should fall into the trap of somehow thinking that there's something unacceptable about that. But I do think what's important is to ask ourselves, what are the reasons for not having children? And is it because you genuinely, this is just not what you want for your life, or is it because the constraints themselves seem so huge and the trade-off seems so huge? And I guess I would go back to this whole notion of quote-unquote having it all, because that somehow implies that you have to make a choice. And why should we have to choose between two of the most important human activities that life consists of? But so there were two groups of men who fall into that category. The first would be the unencumbered. And for those men, it was very clearly a decision about not living up to the definition of a marriageable man is the kind of term that we use in the U.S. I've never liked that term. It was coined by Bill Wilson to talk about what happens in poor communities, and especially African-American communities. And the problem with that is that it implies somehow that successful manhood has to depend on earning a good living, right, and supporting a family, as opposed to being a good father. And for most of those men, those quote-unquote, and I use the word unencumbered, I've tried so hard to try and figure out a non-evaluative term for that. But in those cases, it very much had to do with what I would sadly say was almost a sense of, if I can't live up to these standards of manhood, then I don't have almost the right to do this. As if this were as if parenthood itself were some luxury that, or you have to earn, as opposed to simply a right that we all have. The second group of men who would fall into the category of not having children, ironically, are the egalitarians. And for those men, it had to do with a personal choice, a dilemma, an absolute conflict between two parts of their identities that they valued, but they felt they did not have the ability to combine. And on the one hand, if they chose to have a child, then they knew one of two things would happen. Either they would sacrifice their own careers, or they would sacrifice their partner's career. And so that, again, to me seems like an impossible and unfair choice to ask someone to make. So I think that if I were to try and put that all together, and it's a really good question, I would say that all of those choices are the result of institutional arrangements that on the one hand set a standard of manhood that gives you, rather than of humanhood, about the right, the ability to be a parent, and the other which pits parenthood against the other parts of our lives which matter just as much. And we should be able to say that, and we shouldn't have to say one matters more than the other, and that in order to be a parent, I either have to give up my personal ambitions or my partner's. So I see all of this as very institutionally framed. I wish we could conduct a personal experiment in a utopian society, and then find out who chose and chose not to have children. Only then would we know what that meant, apart from all the social conditions that impinge on us. But I would also add, even for the egalitarians who did have children, having more than one child in the U.S. was considered to be just as risky. So it's not just whether or not you choose, but how many you feel you can manage. And in a society that claims to value children but shows almost no institutional support for them, either through public policy or through private organizations, the hypocrisy is there in the institutions. It's not a child-friendly society.
Thank you both for the American and the Israeli. I've been studying Japanese fathers, involved fathers, Japanese fathers who I call actually the working father. I just want to talk about working fathers. And I was thinking, you were mentioning pioneers, and you say the pioneers are those who struggle against the institutions. And I wanted to ask you, and I wanted to combine maybe the work that you mentioned, or your sort of work in part of your part about slow change. Because you all emphasize all the time, the resilience of gender inequality. Of course, in Japan, it's not the place that we would say that it's gender equal, but on the other end, what I find in my research about fathers, this very small group, they are pioneers in a way, ideologically also. So maybe it's irrelevant, but I wanted to ask if you had, like, some of the fathers were they part of groups who do they want to bring change? Do they want to bring change in gender relations? I'm not talking about the father himself.
Yes, I think the answer is yes to both. Ideologically, yes, that I think they come out of a set of cultures that there are also men who in many ways have de-escalated career and redefined it. Because part of the new economy is about not moving up the ladder, but managing your own life. And so in those cases, that's how they thought about it. But it's also true. I mean, I use this one example. I mean, I interviewed this young man who, and I interviewed in this sort of free-floating environment where self-employed freelancers came together. Most of them were men because this was around tech, which unfortunately is heavily dominated by men. But there were children roaming around there. The sort of free, I'm suddenly reminded, I never thought of this before. There are workplaces in the US now, places like WeWork, for example, which are workplaces and only, I can't figure out now whether coffee houses are now workplaces or workplaces are now coffee houses. And those, people now can bring their pets to work. So you got to figure maybe the next step is if you can bring your pet to work, maybe you're allowed to bring a human being to work too. So I think that may be one of the experimental up from the bottom types of arrangements that emerges. Yeah.
I wonder if you shared in your research the question of religion, which means did religious men tend to be more conservative regarding the role of family more than others?
Good question.
Can you repeat the question? He asked you to repeat the question. Oh, somebody is translated.
Oh.
Just the role of religion.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? It's not a, this mic does, okay, it's working. Good question. I always ask religion. I always wait till the end of the interview. I don't, but I think this is, again, another, especially in the US, so I can't speak for Israel. A religion is, I think, a prime example of what people say versus what they do. So some of the most genderly flexible people I spoke with were, one was a Mormon. Do you know Mormons are, yeah. California has got a lot of diversity of religions. In fact, a number of people were Asians who were bringing in Asian philosophies. There were very serious Christians as well. I did not find a link between religion because the choices people made were so contingent. I think the one place that religion did enter the conversations was when people were struggling about whether or not to stay with their partners. And I didn't mention that today at all, but I was shocked by the high percentage of people who were, I'm wondering if I re-interviewed them now, if they would even still be together. I did get a sense that religion might be holding people together who might not otherwise stay and try and work it out, but not in terms of decisions about parenting or work or those were very, now I also want to say I interviewed in the Bay Area and in New York, so I'm on the cutting edge of these areas, but I've also believed that this is sort of, a cutting edge implies that others will follow. And certainly if you're focusing on metropolitan America, I think these findings apply. I mean, the political divides in the U.S. now seem to be much more about urban density, concentration versus sort of rural, more traditional areas, and not region of the country. So, and this may be uniquely American because we are such a multi-religious society. I'm sure if I had been interviewing evangelicals in small towns in Texas, that would have been huge. But it didn't. I think there's a huge disconnect, and the surveys in the U.S. show this, between their religious identity and their actual behavior.
I think it's a question to both of you, I'm not sure. Your research and your lectures, of course, naturally very American, and what was very striking, I think, is that you present couples as if they live in a vacuum. The man, the woman, the child, the one child, and this is it. This is the support system. In Israel, people very much rely on extended family, especially grandmothers, but not only grandmothers, for really daily everything. And I was wondering if, I'm sure it's all over the Middle East. I'm sure it's not only Israel. It's even more so in other countries in the Middle East, where people really live in extended families.
Right.
I'm wondering if this support of the extended family maybe the other way around, maybe
It's a good question. It's a real.
to do it overwork and over hours. I don't know how to analyze it with your research, both Orly and
I want to give this to Orly. I just want to say one quick thing. The people who were most connected to their extended family, by the way, were the people who didn't have children. Because their families' children became their children. And they were huge support networks for their, and in fact, there's so many stories I could tell you. So one of my favorite is about a woman who's working class Filipino, very upwardly mobile, and married to a Latino man who's also, and they never had children. And what they have become is the place where their siblings' children live with them because they've had problems. And so, in some sense, I got the picture from the other side, and that is a major source of importance. In fact, people say, I don't have to have my own children because I've got my nieces, I've got my nephews, and I'm responsible for my parents because my other siblings have other responsibilities. But you're right that we're a very mobile society. And things like housing costs and job opportunities force people to move around a lot. It's hard to make decisions. The singles were the ones who could make their decisions based on their families, whereas in the coupled family groups, they had to collaborate. The collaboration itself was difficult enough. But tell me, Orly, about what's going on here.
Thank you. First, I'd like to remind us all of the book Not So Nuclear Families, which is an American book by Karen Hansen, exactly.
Right.
Karen Hansen says that even though you're not, as an American family raising young kids, even though you perhaps don't live next to your extended families, you would build up a network of families that would support each other, and that couples would not remain the only ones responsible across the day for the kids. So we have to credit American couples for being a little bit resourceful, right? I bet there are huge class differences. We also know of the African-American families that a lot of the time is described in terms of the like family-based or community-based childcare arrangement as preferred over institutionally arranged childcare. So there's also this thing. But I want to relate to your question about neoliberalism, where neoliberalism enters. So on the one hand, you could say that, yes, grandmothering is an alternative to relying on the state, so perhaps we don't need the state to arrange childcare facilities for long hours or anything because grandmothers are there. But if I will go back to Melinda Cooper's argument, what she argues is that when couples rely on their extended families, this doesn't go without a price. Because we have to remember that control and support go together. Exactly. They are the two sides of the same coin. When the extended family supports you, it has also its ways of controlling you. And in this sense, she sees this, the way that neoliberalism push young families and especially single women, single mothers, to rely on their extended families as allowing the extended family to impose more traditional values and demand and require that things are being done their ways. And for example, she gives this, this notion of how families now have to support their children into university as a tradition, as a major engine in promoting traditional values, not allowing students to be the kind of engine they used to be for exactly for critical political acts. But what I really want to say is that in any case, both if we do take into account the extended families and other networks, support networks, and if we're not, we have to recognize that the major failure of us researchers and other scholars interested in what is going on in the private sphere in terms of managing care and employment, but our major failure is not managing to make this into a political issue. It is not, still today, when we don't deal, especially not on the news, in newspapers, you don't see any treatment of these issues, of what happens with care issues, what happens with social services that are targeted to support care in the family and outside the families. All this remain in the real margins of the political discourse. And that is where I think we have to really change the way we deal with these issues, turn them into a lot more politically, politically discussed, politically engaged with. We don't do that.
Just two quick things that you reminded me of. In doing my coding of my interviews, and I have a whole code on family networks, and I quickly realized I had to divide the code into positive support and negative support, which is exactly to say that I think we need to be careful not to idealize.
I don't think you understood my question.
Oh.
My question was, what is the price that the grandparents are paying?
You really didn't understand that grandparents are paying.
Well,
they
that
don't
was
pay prices. They're only rewarded all now. Only rewards, no prices.
Well, actually, that was going to be my second point, which is that what's happening in the U.S., which I think, again, is, classically neoliberal, lack of welfare state. Grandparents are now taking their retirement savings to support their grandchildren, and in the process, losing their own ability to support themselves. Right. And this, to me, is whether, I don't care where the support comes from, the question is, how is, if we don't have collective ways of providing it, then it becomes another form of inequality across classes and across families. And the whole self-reliant family ideology. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for this.